regular board meeting of the Lane County Commissioners, Tuesday, October 10th, 2017. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have a couple of items on the agenda today and a couple of points of order. Commissioner Lycan is excused on county business. Commissioner Williams will either join us late or is excused for the entire afternoon session. So for the meantime, we have a quorum of 3, so we will be able to proceed with the deliberation. First item on the agenda today is a public hearing and setting the final hearing for Order 1710, 17 dash. Why don't I have a number on this? Bear with me just 1 second.
The script has the ordinance
Second reading and public hearing.
Okay, second hearing and public hearing on Ordinance PA 1346. Does that sound better, Amber? Very good.
Thank you.
In the matter of amending the Rural Comprehensive Plan to redesignate land from agricultural land to forest land and to rezone land from exclusive farm use East E40 to impacted forest land F2 and adopting savings and severability clauses. Now, we're having a public hearing today, and the purpose for this hearing is subject to plan amendment and rezoning criteria cited in the agenda cover memo and attachments, including Lane Code 16.400 for Rural Comprehensive Plan amendments, Lane Code 16.252 for zone changes, statewide planning goals, and Rural Comprehensive Plan policies for forest and agricultural goals. B, the subject property is map and tax lot number 17062800000600. The date is October 10, 2017. This hearing is quasi-judicial in nature and is subject to the county's procedures for a de novo public hearing found at Lane Code 14.300. The order of proceedings for this hearing will be first the report by the staff, followed by the applicant's testimony, testimony of persons in favor, testimony by other persons, additional comments by staff, and then applicant's rebuttal. Evidence and testimony must be directed toward the approval criteria or criteria believed to apply to the decision. Failure to raise an issue with sufficient specificity to enable a response may preclude appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals. Failure of the applicant to raise a constitutional or other issue relating to the proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow a response to the issue preludes. Is it preludes or precludes?
Precludes.
Okay, it says preludes. Precludes. Precludes, probably preludes too, but precludes action for damages in circuit court. Let me read that again. Failure of the applicant to raise a constitutional or other issue relating to the proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow response to the issue precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Prior to the conclusion of the public hearing, any participant may request that the hearing be left open to provide an opportunity to present additional written evidence or arguments regarding the application. The board's decision may be appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals in accordance with ORS 197. Only persons who qualify as party may appeal the board's decision to LUBA. At this point, I'm going to call for the disclosure of the board for board members' ex parte contacts and for abstentions due to conflict of interest, ex parte contact, or biases. Commissioner Sorensen.
I have none.
Commissioner Bozievich.
I am aware that Frontier Land Company, LLC, has McDougall Brothers as a partner, and I have spoken to them in the past, but I've never spoken to them about this particular property, and I do not feel there's any conflict of interest or there's any issues with going forward with this.
Thank you, Commissioner Bozievich, and I'm looking at council.
Yeah, I don't see any problem with Commissioner Bozievich participating.
And I have none. Are there any challenges to the hearing authority's qualifications to hear the matter? I see none. Then Ms. Bell, we'll hear the staff report.
Thank you, Chair Farr, and good afternoon, Commissioners. Before you is an applicant-initiated request for a minor plan amendment and concurrent zone change to redesignate approximately 77.1 acres from agricultural to forest designation and to rezone the same property from exclusive farm use E40 to impacted forest lands F2 zoning. The subject property is identified as Assessor's Map and Tax Lot number 170628-600. On April 18th, Lane County Planning Commission held a public hearing on this matter and unanimously passed a motion to recommend board approval. A key part of review of this application for redesignation from agricultural to forest is determining whether or not the subject property qualifies for either farm or forest land designation. In this case, the subject property qualifies for both. The subject property qualifies for agricultural land designation because 100% of the subject property is comprised of Class 1 through Class 4 soils. The subject property also qualifies for forest lands designation because the soils within the subject property are capable of producing more than 50 cubic feet per acre per year of wood fiber. Specifically, the property is estimated to have a capability of 151 cubic feet per acre per year wood fiber. Based on the Oregon administrative rules for the forest statewide planning goal, when lands satisfy the definition requirements of both agricultural land and forest land, an exception is not required to show why one resource designation is chosen over another. The plan need only document the factors that were used to select an agricultural forest, or other appropriate designation. The Rural Comprehensive Plan Agricultural Working Paper documents factors to consider when selecting agricultural or forest land designation on land that meets the definition of both. In this case, the applicants evaluated the agricultural forestry goal interrelationship and found that the property is not suited for farm use based on topography, existing and historic uses on the property, and that the predominant uses in nearby and adjacent lands are residential followed by forest, and therefore the property is better suited as forest designation. Key part of the review for the proposed zone change, and let me just point out, this map here shows the current rural comprehensive plan designation of agricultural. The tax lot, the subject property is tax lot 600 and does not include the smaller property within it, tax lot 800, that's the Sailor Cemetery. And this map shows the proposed rural comprehensive plan designation of forest. This map shows the existing zoning of exclusive farm use E40 and then the proposed zoning of impacted forest lands F2. So a key part of the review for the proposed zone change is whether the property more closely aligns with the characteristics of the F1 non-impacted forest land zone or the F2 impacted forest land zone. This test is set forth in Rural Comprehensive Plan Policy Chapter 4, Policy 15B, that was further interpreted by the board with Ordinance PA 1236. So I'll give a little discussion to the F1 and the F2 tests. With regards to the F1 zoning test, the first and second characteristics were interpreted by the board in Ordinance PA 1236 to focus on the land proposed for rezoning. In this case, the property is not developed with a residence, so it meets that F1 characteristic. It's less than 80 acres, so it does not meet that F1 characteristic. The third F1 characteristic is predominantly ownerships contiguous to other lands utilized for commercial forest or commercial farm uses. In that ordinance, the board adopted findings that this policy was crafted as a means to distinguish large-scale forest land from small-scale non-industrial forest land. The applicant has evaluated immediately abutting properties and found that industrial-scale commercial forest lands are not immediately contiguous to the subject property, and so that particular F1 characteristic is not met. The applicant states that the property is accessed from Knight Road via a private access easement and not an arterial road, and that the access easement the applicant asserts is not primarily intended for forest management, and the property is not primarily under commercial forest management because Frontier Land Company has limited number of holdings and is a small-scale non-industrial forest operation. And therefore, the applicants found that the subject property meets one F1 characteristic, or 20% of the characteristics. With regards to the F2 zoning test, the property is not developed with a dwelling, so it does not meet that F2 characteristic. It is less than 80 acres. It meets that F2 characteristic. For the third characteristic, the applicant has evaluated an approximately 1,000-foot buffer area and has found that 48 generally contiguous tracts, or of those 48 generally contiguous tracts, 63% are less than 80 acres and contain a dwelling, and 67% are in developed and committed exception areas. And finally, the property has access to public facilities and services intended to service rural residences. Therefore, it appears that the subject property meets about 3/4 of the F2 characteristics. And because it meets more F2 characteristics than F1 characteristics, the property is found to more closely align with F2 zoning than F1 zoning. Given that staff find all applicable criteria are met and the proposal is consistent with statewide planning goals and the rural comprehensive plan policies, staff recommend option 1, which is approval of the application, and to enact ordinance number PA 1346 based on findings provided as ordinance Exhibit C. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you. Ms. McKinney, further? Ms. Clark? Okay, very well. Then with no further testimony, no further report by staff, I will open the public hearing. And we have signatures. First, I will call for applicant's testimony. Please state your name and address for the record again.
Kim O'Day, Law Office of Bill Close, 375 West 4th, Eugene, 97401. Good afternoon, Commissioners. This is going to be a short hearing. I'm excited. Once again, this is one of those applications that Planning Commission and staff and we all worked very hard to get to a point where we're all sitting here in agreement today, and that's always a really good place to be in front of you all. We don't have to take up a lot of your time, especially me. And this particular property, I went back to the early 90s, as far back as I could easily get aerial photos. It has never been in any sort of farm production whatsoever. It's always been in forestry. I was clear cut in 1994, as far back as I could get. So I'm not quite sure how it ever got designated farmland in the first place, but it's been used throughout the history that I can find as forest land. So that's why we're here today. The zoning characteristics, we've been through these F1 to F2 criteria so many times at this point. I'm always glad for the guidance in that ordinance 1236, because the board did a very good job of going through each and every one, so that each time we do this, all we have to go is back to that ordinance and apply the factors as the board said to apply them, and we get to a point that's either X or Y, and we don't have to argue about it anymore. So we ended up in a good place this time with a 20% F1 and a 75% F2, and so it's more appropriately zoned F2. And that is pretty much the end all of my presentation, unless you have questions.
Any questions from the board? I see none. Thank you today.
Thank you.
Then we will entertain testimony of persons in favor. Do I have anyone signed up in favor? I see none. Testimony of other persons? I see none. Additional comments by staff?
Staff have no further comments at this time.
I see and hear none. Applicant rebuttal? I need none. So then I will at this point close the public hearing. Discussion by the board. Commissioner Bozievich.
Thank you. And, you know, I have to say I go by this piece of property quite often. In fact, I was by there this weekend twice on bicycle rides as I make my loops from my house and come in from Notai. I swing right down past it to get to Subtle off of either Knight or Notai Loop. And I'm real familiar with the property, that it sits up on a hill, which I think somebody looking at a map sometime a long time ago saw all those EFU properties along Subtle where it is flat, and didn't realize there's a ridge line right there, and you have to go up a significant hill to even get to this property where the cemetery is. And that may have been where sometime back in the 80s, somebody just looking at maps threw an EFU on this instead of a forest zoning. But it's to the best of my knowledge, I don't think it's ever been in farm use either. So it does seem to fit all those criteria. So I don't have any additional questions for staff or the applicant, it seems like we've got a unanimous recommendation from the Planning Commission, and unless there's other discussion, I'm willing to move forward at this point to a decision.
Further discussion by the board? I see none. Then Commissioner Bozievich.
So then I'd like to move approval of ordinance number PA 1346.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Bozievich, seconded by Commissioner Sorensen. Discussion to the motion? I see none. Mr. Rickoff, this is an ordinance, so we'll need a roll call vote. Excuse me, a roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Aye.
Commissioner Bozievich.
Aye.
Chair Farr.
Aye. Passes 3-0 with Commissioners Lycan and Williams excused. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bell. Thank you, Ms. McKinney. And now, Mr. Rickoff, we have before us Order 1710-1015 in the matter of approving large events occurring in Lane County parks in fiscal year 2017-18. Today we have on our panel Mike Russell and Tim Elsey. And Ms. Hoover, thank you for joining the panel today. Mr. Rickoff.
At this point, I'd like to turn it over. Mike, you can get us started here?
Yes.
Mike Russell.
Good afternoon, Board. The item before you today is a culmination of a lot of work to get to this point where we are actually at the point where we are reviewing applications and making recommendations to the board on large events within county parks. As you know, on May 2nd, the board considered and approved Lane County Parks large event assessment criteria and provided the Parks Advisory Committee latitude in implementing Appendix G of the Large Events Task Force recommendations in establishing the oversight group. And as a result of that, the oversight group was convened and first met on June 12th and then again on July 10th, 2017 to review 6 large event applications and make recommendations as to whether they should proceed and be held within Lane County Park facilities. The board accepted the recommendations of the Large Events Task Force, you'll remember, in their entirety with no changes. Recommendations related to the formation of the Large Events Oversight Group indicate the board's review and approval of the assessment criteria and appointment of the members of the oversight group. And so the staff and Parks Advisory Committee subsequently worked to develop the assessment criteria, form the oversight group, and evaluate the submitted applications and make recommendations for your approval. So that's why we're here today. You will see in the staff memo the members of the Large Event Oversight Group, many former folks that were involved in the Large Events Task Force, as well as Terry Ney, Veneta Lane Rural Fire Chief, Friends of Zumwalt Park representative, and some environmental expertise, as well as the entire Parks Advisory Committee is part of that. So as I said, a total of 6 applications were submitted to the oversight group, and they reviewed scores and scored. There was one event that was withdrawn. The Hike for the Homeless proposed for Mount Pisgah was withdrawn, and that was from the Eugene Mission. They just didn't have enough planning time between the application process and the event, so they will be resubmitting, but they withdrew during this process.
They voluntarily withdrew their.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, and it was a timing issue for them, so they just didn't have the resources to make that work. So we honored that, and so the remaining 5 events, the group acknowledged through the assessment tool, through going through the scoring exercise, that the assessment tool may need to be tweaked due to 2 long-standing successful events, and those were the City of Veneta's Zumwalt Camping and then Lane County Park's own 4th of July celebration at Fern Ridge, scored too low to meet the approval criteria. So they established a minimum score. Those 2 events did not meet the minimum score. So there was acknowledgement these are long-standing events, they're good events, but with the assessment criteria that you adopted, they just didn't meet the threshold to be approved. During the discussion, there was a question on the urgency of approving the event. So the discussion was, and I know Director Elsey has some insight into this discussion as well, so I'll turn it over to him in a minute. But the discussion was, these are good events. Should we rescore them? Should we look at the assessment criteria? Should we just approve them anyway? That kind of thing. And part of that discussion was the urgency for specifically the city of Veneta to know whether or not they were going to have an event or not the next year. Staff indicated that there was a need to make a decision then so that city of Veneta would have some certainty on their event. After reflection, it was determined, or we contacted the city of Veneta, and I'll turn it over to Tim for the rest of that.
You bet. And one of the things that you will notice today is that we are not providing a staff recommendation that mirrors a recommendation of the Large Event Oversight Committee and the PAC, and we don't do that lightly. So after we got the recommendation from the Large Event Oversight Committee, we did reflect on that and decided that we wanted to ensure that we were honoring the work of the Large Event Task Force. As you're aware, Large Event Task Force met for 16 months and came up with the criteria. So we decided internally that if we could get some leeway on those two events so that the criteria could be looked at to see if a new interpretation or if the criteria needed to be changed so that they could follow through with the process established by the Large Event Task Force and memorialized by this board, then we would prefer to do that rather than the first time we used the scoring criteria to bring two events that did not meet the minimum thresholds to this board and ask you to approve that. So we did contact the city of Veneta, and they were incredibly gracious, and they would like they offered to work with us to see if we could tweak the criteria to see if they could work for these events that we know are successful events, or whether or not we might need to establish that sometimes we would have outlier events that would not fit within the scoring criteria. The PAC has since set a subcommittee that has looked at the criteria, and they will bring recommendations for new interpretations of the criteria. I don't think they're going to change the criteria much, if at all, but new interpretations and new directions to give to the Large Event Oversight Committee so that these two events can be rescored in the future, and if they meet the minimum thresholds, which they expect that they will, then we'll bring those back to you for a with a recommendation for approval. So again, we are not bringing forward the recommendation of the Large Event Oversight Committee and the PAC, and we don't do that lightly.
And those two events are Zumwalt Camping on 4th of July?
That's correct.
Excellent. Any discussion or questions? Ms. Hoover, at this point, would you like to add anything, or do you want to?
Well, I would. I was, along with Mike Russell and John Helmer, one of the creators of this Schedule G, or Appendix G, as we're calling it, to the Large Event Task Force, about having oversight and review of the large events. And I will read one sentence from this. It says, first year considerations. The assessment tool may need to be assessed and refined over time as experience is gained. And when John Helmer and I joined Mike at the table in May, we very much put out a warning that this will be something that will be worked on over time and that there will need to be tweaks. And I think the PAC understands that. The subcommittee that I served on to create the assessment tool understands that. And I think the piece I'm the proudest of is that through our Public Works Director and Parks Director, that we are continuing to honor the work of the Large Event Task Force. It would be a definite step backwards if we just had a couple events and internally staff said, let's put them through anyway. That would take us back to, I won't even name the year, it's a 4-letter word around here, 2013. So I'm pleased that actually this has come up, because there will be events off and on that come in and maybe don't meet the criteria. And already I've talked with staff and the PAC, and they are saying, you know, some of those questions, we got some redundancy, and we weren't sure how we were interpreting the questions. So it's going to be worked on, and I'm very much in agreement that we hold back these two, do some more work, and then there's talk of every March, after the contracts get looked at in January and February, every March that assessment tool is re-evaluated. Is it doing the work for us? Are we doing things correctly and honoring the LETF work? So I'm with staff on this.
Thank you, Thank you for being here in particular, Ms. Hoover, because your testimony lends a great deal of weight to the discussion that we're having today, because otherwise we would be kind of wondering whether or not the task force felt honored or felt that their work was being respected. I'm feeling very comfortable that that is the case. Two things that were said. One thing that you said, Ms. Hoover, the assessment tool may need to be refined, clearly, as time goes on, and not just this one time, maybe again in the future. And something you said, Mr. Elsey, that we do not make this recommendation lightly, that a great deal of thought went into this. You know, I'm going to let other commissioners talk about this, but the year of the children's visual toy, right? The kaleidoscope kind of precipitated the discussion that we're having today. And, you know, that was my first year on the commission, and that was a very harsh year. There was a great deal of finger pointing, a great deal of questioning as to how Lane County on that date and for the future was going to handle large events in our parks, and also how we were going to handle a master plan for the parks. Well, since then, Ms. Hoover, you have been instrumental in addressing both of those issues, both the large events and the master plan for the parks. Today, 4 years later, our parks are significantly further ahead in terms of addressing generations in the future of park users, and thank you very much for that. Thank you for bringing this to us today. At this point, I'll turn it over to the board for questions or comments. Commissioner Bozovich.
No real questions or comments. I will note that I think that, you know, the city of Veneta was fine with delaying and reviewing, and it does sound like it also gives them an opportunity maybe to change the wording in their application, better explain, so they score higher. So it may also be not just the scoring process that needs tweak. It may actually be the applications that just need to be written to better fit the criteria and explain how they meet the criteria at the same time. So I think a combination of the two will get those two particular events over the top. So I don't, and particularly because both events are far enough off in the future and don't need the necessity. I fully agree with the staff's decision to, you know, buck the recommendations and go ahead and set those two aside for now, and then have them go through the process properly and come back to us with the correct scoring and not having to have any exceptions made, because I think that does honor the original large events task force and trying to make sure that that oversight's done in a proper way. So I appreciate that. I will note that the Elmira Cross Country event, which was really a request for a backup venue, has become a primary venue since they submitted. Their primary venue was the Oregon Country Fair site, and apparently they can't hold the cross country event there for other reasons. So they were really looking forward to us moving forward today so they can have some surety. So, you know, it even makes sense that we separated these two, you know, questionable events, and we can get these 4 events that have met the criteria approved, and they can go on with their planning and move ahead. So I'm looking forward to moving ahead on that.
Excellent. Okay, no further discussion. I look at the 6 events that we had listed, including Hike for the Homeless, which was withdrawn, and you had real diversity there, a lot of different types of events, but I don't see any alternate music festivals.
No comment.
No comments on that, okay. One of the first times I met you, Mike, was standing in a cornfield on the other side of the river and we were shouting in each other's ears, as I recall, and couldn't really hear even then. So once again, I'm very proud of the process that we went through, because quite often we look at things that we're doing and decisions that we're making based upon processes that are in place. And sometimes we go, who came up with that process? Well, I'm confident that in the future, people are going to say, hey, who came up with that process? Very different analysis. So very good. Then we have before us Order 1710-1015 in the matter of approving large events occurring in Lane County Parks fiscal year 2017-2018. Commissioner Bozievich.
So I'd like to move approval of Order 1710-1015.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Bozievich, seconded by Commissioner Sorensen. Any discussion to the motion? I see none. I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Passes 3-0 with Commissioner Lycan excused, county business, and Commissioner Williams excused. Thank you. Thanks again, Ms. Hoover, and I hope I have lots of opportunity to thank you in the future, but you've been a stalwart throughout the entire process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those compliments.
Well, that's happy. We'll move along then with item 11C on our agenda today, which is a work session on the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan Project. And today we have Ms. Bell, and I see we have a panel. Ms. Bell, Ms. Rickoff, I'll turn it over to you and for introduction of the panel. Thank you.
I'm hoping this will be happy as well. At least it should be the start of a great piece of work, great piece of collaboration between the City of Eugene and Lane County. As you know, that in my office I have one map on the wall, and that map is the checkerboard area of River Road in Santa Clara. It is a place of pretty significant concern, and what we have for you today is Amber Bell with Lydia McKinney and I believe Zach Galloway from the City of Eugene. They're here to talk about the initiation of a 2-year effort to collaboratively work on planning issues in the Santa Clara and River Road area.
And I noticed that Terry Harding is in the audience. Welcome,
Yes.
Ms. Harding. Thank you for being here today. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. We'd like to provide you with an introduction to the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood planning effort that the City of Eugene is commencing this fall. Again, Zach Galloway from the City of Eugene is joining us today. He is the primary contact and the project manager for this project, and he'll be providing us with a presentation in just a bit. This is an approximately 2-year effort to develop a community vision that will guide future decision making and planning for River Road and Santa Clara communities. The project will include unincorporated areas within the City of Eugene's urban growth boundary, as well as the entirety of the Santa Clara neighborhood, part of which extends beyond the urban growth boundary and is within the Metro Plan area and is within Lane County's planning and zoning jurisdiction. This project will be a collaborative one. The county staff have committed to participating in key events, such as there's a kickoff public event on October 17th that we'll be attending. There will be a group discussion with members from the Santa Clara rural area later this fall. And then county staff will also be participating on a regular basis as part of a project management team throughout the life of the project. Transportation planning staff will be providing technical feedback at key points, and then land management division management will be providing policy direction at key points throughout the project. We will continue to provide the board and the Planning Commission with updates over the next 2 years as the project progresses. And I'll now hand it over to Zach, and then we'll be available for Q&A.
Mr. Galloway, welcome.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you, commissioners and Mr. Chair. You heard a lot about the collaboration between the city and the county, and I actually would like to start with collaboration between the city, the county, and clarify that it also includes our community organizations there. We've got representatives from River Road with us today, and honestly, this the good footing on which we stand today is really attributed to the Santa Clara and the River Road community organizations and all of their past work for for more than 5 years in kind of leading up to this initiation of the 2-year effort next Tuesday. So I want to just keep that in mind. It's not just the collaboration between city and county, but the community organizations have really led this effort, and I think that'll become clear throughout the course of this brief presentation. We are turning our attention today and this fall to the beginning of the project and this 2-year process we're about to embark on. Largely at City Council direction. This has been something embedded in our Envision Eugene documents for several years now, as urban growth boundary expansion was taking priority within our planning department. We have been kind of assisting and supporting the 2 community organizations leading up to this moment, and now with adequate resources and attention, our City Council has directed us to make this a priority and turn our attention to these 2 neighborhoods in this neighborhood planning effort. So I think all parties are excited to get started with that. This is an introduction, so I'll just start kind of a high level that the neighborhood associations have worked for years to do their own outreach, and I think have really established quite a model for what other neighborhood groups can do within our community for themselves and build a tremendous amount of capacity. They began with something that they refer to as the Scroll Project, which is Santa Clara River Road Outreach and Learning. That ultimately morphed into the Script Project, which is Santa Clara River Road Implementation Planning Team. Both of those attempted to identify key issues, areas of concern, if you will, in the neighborhoods, and then move into, with the Script process, an attempt to identify solutions to those previously identified issues. The things that came out of that, very broadly: land use, transportation, parks and recreation, or parks and natural resources, governance, public safety, and economic development. We will be tackling 4 of those with the neighborhood plan, since that's more of an appropriate tool to take on land use, transportation, economic development, parks and natural resources. The public safety and the governance issue are certainly all kind of wound up in a lot of what we anticipate tackling within those other 4 topic areas. From a logistic, I guess, or project management standpoint, there's a lot of things we're trying to improve upon from a process standpoint. One of those, I believe, is in your packet, a draft initiation letter that is essentially a good faith effort that's being entered into on the part of the city, the county, and the 2 community organizations, making this commitment that over the 2-year time frame we'll work to get to the point of neighborhood plan adoption. We've also worked through a project charter and a public involvement plan that kind of lays everything on the table, and I think from a process or for procedural standpoint really puts us in a good position for success moving forward. So I like to just kind of go through the newspaper approach of the who, what, when, where, why, and whenever we're starting this sort of project, and introduce you to that. So I'll just orient you to the map here. The green line that's on the map at the very top is the Metro Plan boundary. The blue, more frequently dashed line, is the urban growth boundary line for the city of Eugene, which I imagine you all are familiar with. The 2 shades of gray correspond to the Santa Clara and the River Road community, Santa Clara to the north, and the River Road Community Organization to the south, or south of Beltline. The geographic reality here is that Santa Clara extends beyond the urban growth boundary. That was a request that came from the Santa Clara Community Organization that in the course of doing neighborhood planning for the neighborhood that we would do it for the whole neighborhood. Thus the need to collaborate very closely with the county in case there are issues identified throughout the course of public outreach and engagement that are things, outside of that urban growth boundary where we, as the city, typically focus. The last thing to highlight here is the what's referred to as the key transit corridor along River Road. So that's something that the city of Eugene and LTD have been working closely on through the Moving Ahead project to look at future build out of our key transit corridor. We were successful, the city collaborating with LTD, we were successful in securing a grant from the Federal Transit Administration that will fund a more detailed look at that key transit corridor, as well as the areas around that, thinking of redevelopment, how that transitions into the neighborhood, how that serves transit, and how it also respects the character and the nature of the development that's there today in the residential areas in River Road. Another thing to highlight here, which I think is relevant, and I think Mr. Rickoff touched on briefly, is what's not on the map, and you don't see city limit lines. And that's partly intentional because for the sake of this project and for the sake of this process, we'll be reaching out to everybody, regardless of whether they're in the city or the county. These decisions will impact neighbors equally, regardless of what jurisdiction they're in. So just do want to highlight that. With any large process like this or project, you typically begin with your scope of work, and that becomes a Gantt chart and lots of little lines and dates and milestones, and we recognize pretty quickly that's not a way to grab a lot of folks' attention. So we have developed this process graphic to really lure people in, get them engaged, talking about where we're headed over the next 2 years. So if you look to the upper left, that number 1, reaching out, that's really where we are today. The fall of 2017, everything I've described from scroll and script and the identification of these key issues that the neighborhoods want tackled over the next few years is really upstream and off of this particular graphic, but it really lays the foundation for where we're headed. So beginning, well, really it's already begun, but in earnest on next Tuesday afternoon, October 17th, we'll have a large community event at North Eugene High School. We'll do a lot of, over several hours in the evening, attempting to identify values and areas where the public really loves their neighborhood, things they want to retain, things they want to protect, and then also talk about hopes for the future and things they like to see in the community. So we're really in this idea generation phase right now. Moving through the winter and into the spring, we'll be developing a vision that kind of sets the high-level view of the community for the next 20, 30 years. An action plan there in phase 2, spring of next year, that identifies actions that would actually implement that vision, and then moving downstream eventually to what we've called making it happen, because we wanted to avoid as many kind of wonky policy terms like implementation as possible. You see new development standards highlighted. You see zone changes highlighted. Those are things that from the planning division's perspective, we can control. But it's not to say that there aren't going to be a lot of other things in that action plan that we already anticipate just from initial public input that we would be addressing in the action plan. We're just highlighting those few that we would expect to be adopted concurrently with a neighborhood plan. And then ultimately moving into adoption in front of, well, you can see there, the city council as well as this board of commissioners. One more detailed look kind of behind the scenes into the decision making at the neighborhood level. There's this simple chart, which is more along the lines of what I'm capable of, as opposed to the artistic thing you just viewed. So we'll be working with the general public. From that, we've working with the script group, our project management team has identified the need to have focus groups to address these key topic areas: land use, transportation, parks and natural resources, economic development. There's an other category there for other issues that we anticipate will arise. We're in the process of forming a community advisory committee that the 2 community organizations will appoint. Several members of that committee will be sitting board members of the River Road and Santa Clara community organizations. And for the Santa Clara community organization, there are seats reserved for those members outside of the urban growth boundary to ensure that there's community representation from the full community. Moving through the kind of review and process, you see there's highlighted there the technical advisory committee, what we've referred to as a triple bottom line sounding board. Both of those from a technical standpoint and from a policy standpoint respectively, essentially attempt to kind of lay the sideboards on the project. So we're high level, we're visioning, but we have to recognize that there are some kind of community-wide policy objectives that have to be respected and understood throughout the process. And then ultimately, as you move further to the right, you see our planning team, our project management team. You can imagine compiling the final vision and the documents and everything, and then moving into, after this 20-month period, moving into an adoption process that would take us through the two planning commissions, as well as this board and the City Council of the City of Eugene. So currently, we've been frenzied over the last month with all forms of outreach, trying to get the word out about this. Well, I say last month, it's really been for the last 2 months, trying to raise awareness of everything Scrip's been doing and ensure that people are coming to North Eugene High School next Tuesday evening. We really couldn't do it without a tremendous amount of volunteer effort from both River Road and Santa Clara. They've been out canvassing their neighbors, finding people at the Sunday Streets events, on the bike path, at Fred Meyer, you name it. There's tons of flyers out there. There are a lot of, we did direct mail to every single resident, every single address in both communities. Those went out early last week, so a 2-week notice in advance. We have a growing interested parties list that's probably close to 400 people at this point that receive our e-newsletter and invitations that way. I expect that to keep growing throughout the life of the project. We've also are recognizing that we're very good with conventional outreach, doing kind of tabling in front of Fred Meyer or the neighborhood grocery stores and doing these sorts of big public workshops, but we recognize that a lot of folks are not going to come to the public workshops in the evening. So we are doing some targeted outreach to folks that we know are underrepresented in a lot of our more conventional forms of outreach, and trying to replicate what we do at those workshops with these specific groups. You can see a list there. We've done it with a group of the leadership class at North Eugene High School. We've done a couple small engagements with folks in the Latino community already. We'll be doing that throughout. You heard Amber mention that we're also going to do something similar to that with a small group of folks outside the urban growth boundary to really target their issues that are whatever those may be. We don't know at this point. That's the point of public outreach. And then lastly, for those that want to just kind of tune in occasionally, we'll keep the webpage up to date. And you see we've developed a pretty, what we hope is a simple enough name for everybody to remember, River Road Santa Clara Plan.org. And then I would just highlight here also, as part of that underrepresented group, the flyers and the invitations, as well as our webpage and a tremendous amount of other material is all available in Spanish and English. So we've tried to translate as much as possible, recognizing that there is a large percentage of Spanish speakers in especially in the River Road community. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have about the project.
Thank you, Zach. Excellent presentation and very good graphics, even the ones you didn't do. I like yours, though. But just a couple of things before I call on the board for questions. I have a lot of questions, a lot of comments regarding this. Let's see, shall I use I'm giddy with excitement about this. I mean, this is long overdue in terms of the city and the county working together on what I have been calling the frontier, is that dotted line where I get these services and I don't. But we live next door to each other. So, and you've already pointed out something that Mr. Rickoff has on his wall, and that is the checkerboard. It's not a checkerboard, but that's what we refer it to, where really people have a different level of services. There are different classes of services that are available to people who live virtually next door to each other, or literally next door to each other. And I know that that's a part of the issue. I'm not going to bring that up as a problem that we've got to address, because I know you know that. I don't need to tell you. And everybody sitting in this room knows that we have a series of issues that occur naturally because of that divide that is in River Road and Santa Clara. It occurs other places, but no place quite as acute as we see it in the River Road Santa Clara area. And before I know, I represent River Road. Commissioner Bozovich represents Santa Clara, basically. And when I was a state rep, I represented Santa Clara. I was a state rep for the western half of Santa Clara. So we're both very familiar with the neighbors, both inside and outside the city limits, view as issues. One big issue that both Commissioner Bozovich and I are acutely aware of, and I'm not putting words in his mouth, he'll say them himself, we have another board in that area that I didn't hear you mention, the River Road Parks Board. So very important that they are part of the community there. Many of the board members have been on the board for a long time. They have distinct ideas about what is needed there. But significantly, and I know you know this, their tax base is daily, almost daily, being eroded. And consequently, the great park that they have out there, which is Emerald Park, is getting less and less and less and less resources to do the things that they don't want to diminish. I'm not going to suggest that we talk about that now, but we have until 2018. That's the end of the plan adoption that you have on the board to talk about it. And it's important that we make certain that all of these tables are on all of these issues are on the table, because this is the point in time where we can set a tone for the future. And not only with this particular project, but this project can be used as a herald for other similar types of cooperation projects that need to happen between the county and the city. As the city of Eugene expands, or as the city of Eugene flexes inside of its own current existing city limits and urban growth boundary. A lot of opportunity, a lot of issues, a lot of opportunity, and I'm excited to get the process started. So thank you for the great presentation. I'm really quite excited about it. I'm not going to talk about things that people have been telling me over the last 2, 3, 17 years, but we'll address things as they come up. And I see from the brightness in your eyes and from the brightness in everybody's eyes in the audience that this is a good thing. What we're doing is a good thing. So we'll move forward. Commissioner.
I could just address the Parks District and let you know that we have, I've been on a bit of a roadshow to attend as many boards in the area as possible, and they are one that I joined their board last month and gave a similar presentation and sought any sort of input. And we've invited them to participate on the Community Advisory Committee that I discussed there as ex officio members. So they're invited to every member or every meeting, and certainly will be informed and in the know. Part of the reason we're not addressing Parks and Recreation, but instead are looking at Parks and Natural Resources, is just recognizing kind of the higher level view of the neighborhood plan, as opposed to kind of Parks and Recreation operations, and knowing that they have their own vision for what that park is, and the city's Parks and Open Space master plan's ongoing, and so we don't want to be duplicating work that's already out there.
I had an informed hunch that you were involved with the Parks District. And it's not very often I hear Parks and Recreation mentioned in the same sentence when we're from the city of Eugene, because that's two different departments, right?
It is.
It is. Okay, very good. Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. I'm very interested in this. Also, I had the privilege of representing this area as a state senator, and although my district, my commissioner district doesn't include this area, I'm still quite interested in it, and also making sure that the neighborhood groups, organizations, and other organizations are pulled into that. So I appreciate you mentioning the neighborhood organizations. Besides the Park and Recreation District, I want to call out the Santa Clara Rural Fire Protection District, another overlapping or involved jurisdiction out there. I think that that's an important part of the whole planning effort, is to plug in with I see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elected directors of the fire district. And also the city councilors in Eugene who represent this area. And I know there's 2 or 3 councilor wards that are in this area. And obviously you're more attuned to that than the county side, but I do think that they should be involved and briefed and whatever. Are there 3? Are there 3?
There are 2. Ward 6 used to kind of stretch over there, doesn't anymore.
Oh, Ward 6 used to, no, it doesn't. So, there's a couple of counselors. I'm sure they have a big interest in this as well. And another idea that I am struggling with, I think everybody in local government, maybe even everybody in government is struggling with, is we make these efforts at outreach. So we'll have this big thing next week at the school, or we've done this here with the county. We've had poster sessions in the evening, come and learn about X or Y or Z, and we'll put all this effort into an electronic newsletter. We'll do a mailing, and then like 10 people show up, 10 out of 50,000 that we've targeted. So I had this idea that with the advent of these email newsletters and the people that you're gathering these emails, and I think that's the greatest, cheapest way of asking people, would you like to be, on our email list? And maybe challenge them to say, if you get together 20 people, we'll come to you. Because the group itself, I believe you said 400 people. Was it 400?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, 400 people have been willing to sign up on the email. Now, it may well be that only 2 of those 400 would actually take you up on this and say, yeah, we'd like you to come to our blah, blah, blah meeting and give a presentation. But if you made the affirmative effort, and I'm not saying you shouldn't have the other outreach that you're doing, but maybe make an option for, say, cut back on your proposed fixed meeting schedule and instead invite the people to propose times. That way you're able to help us as elected officials. And the way you're helping us is this way. Those people are out there whether you brief them or not. Okay? And what happens is after they have not gone to the formal programs and after you have determined that there's no opposition because there's no one coming to the meetings to raise the opposition, then their outlet, when they hear this is coming before the city council or the board of commissioners, their outlet then isn't to say, oh, by the way, there's 10 of us here at the Anti-River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan Group, and we want to come down and really give you a piece of our mind. And that's what often derails planning, in my view. So one way to head that off is to keep reminding people that if they want to get a briefing on this and find out the latest of what's going on, that you're willing to do it. Now, I think you should have some minimums. If one person calls up and says, I want the full thing you gave to the Board of Commissioners, and I want it in my living room next week. No, you're not going to do that. But if you give them something that you think is reasonable, if 5 people came to your big meeting at North Eugene High School, or 10, would you do it? If you got 5 people, probably you would. And so I'm just saying I think that that is a way to cut off the last minute, oh, we never knew anything about this. No one ever briefed us. When you've gone to all this effort, you've gone to all this huge effort. So just point that out. And if you want to, say, it was Commissioner Sorensen, who's all the way over in South Eugene now, that made these ideas, then you can blame me because it's not going to really hurt me too bad to be blamed. But I think that the folks that are trying in the community organizations and the professional staff to involve people could be aided by that type of outreach. That we're not just going to make one presentation, and if you can't come, because it's too amorphous. I mean, would I go to this meeting? Hey, we're going to talk about our plan for our community. You haven't told me that you're going to do anything bad to where I live yet. See? And that's what's going to blow the thing up at the end. So why not anticipate that? Anyway, I think it's a great job. I agree with Commissioner Farr. People seem to have smiles on their face. We don't normally see that in this room. that often. And so it's nice to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Sorensen. And remember, you do represent Whitaker, which really there's kind of a blurred line there between River Road and Whitaker. And in fact, I don't know if I could walk that line.
Maury Jacobs Park
Maury
is about
Jacobs
the,
is basically
that's
it.
the landmark, yeah.
But which part, which board, I don't know. It's a big park. Great. Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. So annexation, there, I said it. It's out there. No, we're not ignoring it. Just had to say that. Because that's, when you get down to the long story of River Road in Santa Clara, it goes back to sewer lines and annexation and all sorts of hard feelings between non-residents and the city of Eugene, and there's a long history there. And in fact, as you go on, you have your 30 years of history there. The second bullet point I participated in because I lived in the River Road neighborhood along with Ms. Riley. We were around for that River Road Santa Clara Urban Services Committee back, I think we started in '99 and the report came out in 2002. So even that took time. But I moved into River Road in '93 and rented a house on Horn. I bought a house in '94 on Hardy, and then I moved up and bought a house on Sunnyside in '99, and then eventually I moved out of the country in 2006. But I spent a significant amount of time living in River Road, so this is something that's been a long time coming, because back in '99 I was advocating on the committee that we needed a refinement plan. River Road Santa Clara needed a refinement plan, and it was all about, we also needed alternative design standards, because one of the things we were losing in River Road and Santa Clara was the neighborhood character, and that we had that rural residential feel, open section roadways, larger parcels, because it used to be all well and septic, and that was going away with the newer desire for compact urban development that was being kind of forced upon some of the neighborhoods. And then we see the real conflict where we drop a set of apartments next to that kind of rural residential neighborhood, and next thing you know, we're having fistfights over parking spaces. So it's a long time coming and getting this all done. The other aspect of it was, for the first 5 years I lived in that neighborhood, I also was the head of engineering for Branch Engineering and did a lot of land development work in River Road in Santa Clara, and saw that I was having to develop to these urban standards, go through annexation, develop an area for urban standards. And I was building half roads to an urban standard because I was developing the parcel that was on the south half of a road, and the north half was still open section, and we were building like 2/3 of a road. And sometimes even the other third was still gravel, and it looked ridiculous, and set up just such a horrible situation, with the developing those standards. And the secondary thing was there was no place to take runoff up there. So one of the things that's got to be a piece of this, and I expressed this to our planning staff, is we can't forget about infrastructure master planning as we go through this. We can draw all sorts of lines and make all sorts of colors for this area ought to be rezoned that, and there should be these standards for that area. But if we can't get the water from that new development out of there, and we're going to flood the neighbors, which is what's currently happening out there, because there's a lot of development that was done without a lot of careful thinking, where there's ditches that have been actually blocked off, particularly in some of the Santa Clara areas and even in some of the River Road areas. So there's dead-end ditches that people are dumping more water into, and eventually somebody's getting a flooded backyard. We have to deal with that. That has to be thought out a little bit. So as that diagram that you had up there that had other focus groups on it, in that one piece where you had all the little groups that were going to look at things, there needs to be some kind of technical advisory group that includes folks that are looking at the infrastructure. I know you had one specifically for transportation, one specifically for parks, but I did not see anything that dealt with stormwater, sewer lines, water utilities, any of those basic things you need to ultimately have urban levels of development as we develop this plan. We don't want to develop in a vacuum that way, which kind of gets to another comment I'll make at this time. Is we've already mentioned two boards that are there. There's two still missing, which is the River Road Water Board and Santa Clara Water Board. And the issues they're dealing with the spot annexations that keep pulling people out of their service territory, yet they still have infrastructure to maintain based on their rate base and the problems that's creating. So make sure we're not forgetting about those background issues, and which rolls all the way back to the original thing I said when I opened my comments, that word annexation, which is I guarantee you want to fill a room in River Road, Santa Clara, put annexation somewhere in the description of the flyer, because that's ultimately, what people are concerned about, whether it's the person that's, paid for their house in River Road that's a senior citizen that doesn't want their taxes to go up, to the people that are concerned about police services and everything else, and whether they have a vote on city council or not. It's a really divisive issue. And you mentioned annexation, and I guarantee, this plan ultimately starts showing that this all should be part of the city, which ultimately means it should be annexed to get the proper services and everything. If that's not talked about up front as you're going through this planning process, we're going to get the reaction that Commissioner Sorensen described. I didn't hear about the meetings. Why didn't I get notice of that meeting? I don't care. We've done this over and over again with county processes. I'm sure you've done it with city processes. Advertise, hold meetings, hold the meetings out in the neighborhoods and everything else, and people will still, at the end of the process, go, I never heard you guys were doing this. How could you do this to me without telling me about it? So if you don't use that word annexation, that it might be part of the whole process, you're not going to, and it comes up at the end of the process, that's going to be deadly to the process. So don't ignore that word.
Good point, Commissioner Bozovich. Absolutely, and that's kind of the elephant in the room at all times in that area is annexation, whether you're annexed already, not annexed yet, whether you like it or don't like it. The other ally that you have in this is another set of boards that we've not talked about. Now, talk about Spring Creek Elementary School and Irving Elementary School, both in Santa Clara, which are 2 blocks apart, approximately. What's the difference between those two schools? Well, Irving is Bethel. Mm-hmm. Spring Creek is 4J. And they're from here to, you can stand on the roof of one and see the other, and neighbors go from one school district to the other. That's not a bad thing. There's a good coexistence that occurs out there. But the boards of both 4J and Bethel can be assets and allies in this entire process because they both are interested in this area and they both have facilities in the area. So I'm looking at nothing but great stuff out of this. I don't see adversaries. I see people with conditions and issues that need to be discussed that are a part of it. But there are conditions and issues that have not been discussed adequately yet, and this is a process that we can do that. I'm really jazzed about it. Wow. Good stuff is going to happen from this. And in the meantime, we're going to talk about a lot of negative stuff that is occurring and has occurred, that we have optimism that we're going to address it and make sure that the neighborhoods work as neighborhoods, that people with different classes of services, and I will call it different classes of services because it is, can coexist in the same urban environment that they coexist in currently, but better and finding better ways to do it. I think back on 4 years ago now, 3 years ago I guess it was, the tragedy in Emerald Park when there was a shooting and a great deal of friction between the people who were spending a great deal of time in the park and the people who wished that they could spend a great deal of time in the park. Well, the county and the city worked very closely together to mitigate, is that the right word? Mitigate the conditions that were around there. And today, if you talk to people who use the park feels a lot more comfortable. In fact, Terry, I was at the city streets not too long ago, and man, what a great environment that was that day, wasn't it? It was a city event in a separate district park in the county, and all three came together and it worked and people loved it. And guess what? It rained and knocked the smoke down out of the air that day too, so everybody was very, very happy. So I view this as all good stuff moving forward in a really positive vein, so I'm excited about it. So And any further comments or questions from the board?
I'm excited to see it move forward also.
And Carlene's smiling, so that's always good. So
Thanks a lot for your comments and your ideas. I think it'll help us moving forward. We're happy to return to this venue and share updates whenever they're requested.
Well, you have set yourself up for years of comments and and involvement, so thank you very much. Ms. Rickoff, anything further on this item?
Nothing further.
Lydia, Amber, are we finished? Right on. Look at this. I love this. That's great. What a good afternoon we've had.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. So, I'm not always this happy, Greg. That concludes our regular business for the day. We'll move on to item number 12 on our agenda, which is a review of assignments. Ms. Rickoff.
Chair Farr, Commissioners, I have these as two separate assignments, although they were raised together, and I have one request from Commissioner Bosevich to have a work session on disaster response, particularly related to nursing homes, and a request from Commissioner Sorensen looking at planning and impacts of wildfires. That too would be a work session. They might be the same one. I'd ask that staff have a chance to look at it prior to that decision.
I'd probably downgrade mine to, I agreed that we should have a work session on the evacuation process for nursing homes. And I think that the other comments I was making about wildfires, we have a normal cycle with the Oregon Department of Forestry. So they normally come in twice a year. And I'm anticipating they're going to come in within the next couple of months to give us a review of this year's wildfire picture. And it's at that time that I'll probably say, okay, let's do more than we normally do, which we normally just hear from them on a briefing in the spring about the upcoming season, in the late fall, winter, on what happened. And I agree, I think we should do that, but I think we should time it closer to the springtime, when I think it'll have the most impact. That's how I would make a couple of suggestions on that. I think the big thing is this nursing home thing. That was very powerful, the imagery, dragging people out of hospitals and nursing homes, and you're kind of at the most vulnerable point when you're in there.
Excellent. So does that cover your assignment list then, Mr. Rickoff?
So far it does.
All right. Then I see nothing else on our agenda today. We have exhausted our need for executive session this day. So any other business from the board, administration? We're adjourned.